Some mornings feel peaceful, but in truth, they're only the quiet before the storm you never saw coming. My name is Eleanor Walsh, and I'm 68 years old. That morning, sunlight slipped through the white curtain and touched the edge of the coffee cup I had just poured. The scent of roasted beans mingled with the ticking clock, everything so familiar, so safe, that I believed peace would last forever. But something felt off in the way Harold looked at me, in the way he closed his door too softly, in the sigh he didn't know I heard. I didn't realize that only a few hours later, I would be cast out of the very house I had built with 40 years of my life. Our house sits on the edge of a small, quiet town, the kind of place where the air smells of pine and every neighbor knows your name. Harold and I had lived there for more than 40 years. We married when I was 27. From nothing, we built everything. He worked at a machine shop. I taught math at the local high school. Every brick of that house, every coat of paint, every rosebush in the garden came from years of thrift patience and late-night budgeting sessions over black coffee. Our 2 children, Maya and Tom, have families of their own now. They still call it Mom's house. Every Sunday they used to come over for dinner, Maya sharing hospital stories, Tom talking about his latest projects. Harold would laugh, his eyes bright with pride, and say, "We really did it, didn't we?" Ellie, I always thought happiness like that was unshakable, the kind that could weather any storm. There was a time when we were the couple everyone admired. Every Christmas, our house lit up first on the block. Harold built the tree stand himself, and I sewed red stockings for the fireplace. The kitchen smelled of baked bread and cinnamon. The radio played old jazz, and laughter filled every corner. Our life was simple, but it was ours built on shared work, shared dreams, and love that felt unbreakable. In those evenings, he'd read the paper while I sat by the window mending clothes, the rhythm of our small world steady and safe. I truly believed no one could shake that foundation. But time and pride have ways of testing even the strongest walls. The change came quietly. At first, I thought nothing of it when Harold started caring more about how he dressed. A new cologne, a few new shirts. Then the late nights began. He said he was helping a colleague with a project. Soon there were whispers on the phone he took outside, conversations ending abruptly when I entered the room. One evening I noticed a faint lipstick stain on his collar, not mine. "Who called?" I asked softly. "Just a client," he said, not meeting my eyes. I wanted to believe him. God knows I wanted to. But intuition doesn't fade with age. It sharpens. And somewhere deep down, I already knew the man sitting across from me wasn't the same one I'd built a life with. That morning, Harold brewed coffee before I woke up, something he hadn't done in years. He sat at the table, staring at the steam rising from his cup. When I joined him, he didn't smile. Instead, he said slowly, "Eleanor, I think you should stay with Maya for a while. I need some space." I froze. My eyes followed his to the small suitcase by the door, packed, zipped, waiting. "What are you saying, Harold?" I whispered. "This is our home." He wouldn't look at me. "I'll send the rest of your things later," he muttered. "It's for the best." My hands trembled so badly I almost dropped the cup. The house seemed to tilt, the walls closing in. The man who once promised forever now couldn't even meet my gaze. When the door shut behind me, I realized I wasn't just leaving a house. I was being erased from my own life. I didn't cry on the ride to Maya's, not because it didn't hurt, but because no amount of tears could fill the silence he left behind. Through the car window, the house grew smaller, then vanished completely. All that remained was a hollow ache and a spark. A small, steady flame I didn't yet understand. I knew one thing for certain: I wouldn't stay broken. I would come back not to beg for a place, but to take it back piece by piece with truth, reason, and the quiet strength of a woman they had underestimated. That morning felt like a dream I couldn't wake from. The kind where everything looks familiar, but nothing feels right. I folded clothes I never thought I'd pack again, a few blouses, my wedding photo, the small silver brooch my mother left me. Each item slid into the suitcase, like a piece of myself being tucked away. The neighbors watched from their porches, pretending not to stare. When the door shut behind me, the sound was sharp, final, as if the house itself had decided I no longer belonged. When I arrived at Maya's, confusion filled the air like smoke. She dropped everything, eyes wide, voice trembling. "Mom, what happened? Did you two fight?" Tom arrived later, still in his work clothes, disbelief written across his face. They argued not with me, but with each other, searching for sense in something senseless. I told them the truth as gently as I could. Your father asked me to leave. He needs space. Maya's voice cracked. Space from what? From you. I wanted to protect them from the pain, but there was no way to soften the truth. All I could say was, I'll be fine. But even to my own ears, it sounded like a lie. The drive to Maya's house replayed itself in my mind for days. Through the car window, familiar landmarks blurred into ghosts. The bakery where Harold used to buy my favorite scones, the park bench, where we sat every summer evening, the street where we first kissed. Each memory passed like a slow parade of betrayal. I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror. Neat hair, calm face, the image of a woman who refused to look broken even when she was. Inside, shame coiled like a secret I couldn't speak. I wasn't just leaving a home. I was leaving the proof of a life I had built and being replaced by someone younger, louder, and far more temporary. 3 nights later, the phone rang. It was Mrs. Callahan, our neighbor. Her voice was hesitant, but pity always finds its way through politeness. Eleanor, I thought you should know. There's a young woman at your house. She moved in yesterday, drives a red car, calls Harold darling. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. In my mind, I saw her Sophie walking through my kitchen, touching my curtains, sleeping in my bed. The wallpaper I had chosen, the table where my children once blew out their birthday candles. And now, she was there. I thanked Mrs. Callahan and hung up. No screaming, no crying, just silence. A silence so deep it could swallow grief whole. Maya wanted to confront her father. Tom offered to call a lawyer, but I stopped them both. No, I said softly. Not yet. This wasn't just about anger. It was about dignity. If I turned this into a scandal, it would destroy more than him. It would hurt the children, the family name, the memories that still mattered. I decided that day I wouldn't fight like a fool. I would fight like a woman who understands that revenge, when tempered with reason, becomes justice. So I smiled at my daughter and said, "Don't worry, I'm going to handle this my way." She didn't understand what that meant, not yet, but she would. That evening I opened a new notebook. On the first page I wrote in neat, steady letters, "For the truth." Below it a list began to form. Bank statements, property documents, hotel receipts, photos, witnesses. I made notes of every date, every phone call, every memory that could become evidence. Each word steadied my hands. Each line stitched back a small piece of control. By the time I closed the notebook, I wasn't a victim anymore. I was building a case, one quiet, deliberate line at a time. That night, long after everyone had gone to sleep, I sat by the window in Maya's guest room. The moonlight fell across my sewing basket, still half open. I threaded a needle, old habit, old comfort. The rhythm of the stitch calmed me. Outside, the world was silent. Inside, I whispered to myself, "You took my home, Harold, but I still have my hands, I still have my mind, and I will take it back not with rage but with truth." The thread glimmered under the lamplight, looping through the fabric like a promise. It was the same motion I had done for decades, but this time I wasn't mending a dress, I was mending my life. In the days that followed, I turned my pain into purpose. Every tear I hadn't cried became a plan. Every silence turned into a list. If Harold thought age had made me weak, he was about to learn how dangerous a quiet woman can be when she has nothing left to lose. I listed everything I needed: bank records, email trails, property deeds, receipts, photographs, even old colleagues who might have noticed something. The truth wasn't hiding, it was buried under carelessness. And I would dig layer by layer until I found it. The first step was the house itself, the vault of our shared life. When Harold wasn't home, I returned quietly under the pretense of picking up the rest of my things. Every corner of that house still smelled of him, of us. In the study, I found the old metal safe, the one we had used for insurance papers and tax files. The code hadn't changed in years. Inside the papers were neatly stacked tax returns, property ownership documents, joint bank statements, insurance policies. I opened an old shoebox beneath them. Faded letters, handwritten notes, and something new. A receipt for a jewelry store in downtown Hartford dated just 2 months ago. Not in my name, not my size. I didn't take it out, I just took a picture. Every piece would matter later. Next came the people, the ones who had seen but never spoken. I started with Mrs. Callahan across the street. Over tea, she told me she had often seen that young woman bringing groceries into my house, waving cheerfully as if she belonged there. I smiled politely, took mental notes. Then I visited Margaret, my old housekeeper, who had left months before everything fell apart. She remembered overhearing Harold arguing on the phone, something about bank transfers and keeping things quiet. I thanked her, slipped her a folded note with my number, and asked her to write down anything she recalled. Even Harold's old co-worker Peter mentioned seeing Sophie at Harold's office waiting by his car after hours. Each account was another thread in the web I was weaving, and I made sure everyone was recorded, time and date included. Accessing the truth without crossing lines was delicate work. I didn't hack or steal. I simply used what was mine and what the law allowed. With Tom's help, I requested copies of our joint bank statements. Maya, who worked in IT, guided me on how to legally recover emails linked to our shared account. We found transfers made to SC Consulting hotel bookings in Harold's name dinners for two, charged on our joint credit card. The names and dates matched too neatly to be coincidence. Each new discovery felt like both a victory and a cut, one more confirmation of what I already knew but still hated to face. I never wanted proof. I wanted to be wrong. In my small notebook, I recorded everything with precision. April 6th, jewelry store receipt. April 17th, hotel booking, the Windmere Inn. May 2nd, wire transfer, $8,000 to Sophie Collins. The handwriting was steady, clean, unemotional. It had to be. The only way to survive betrayal is to treat it like arithmetic, cold, factual, undeniable. Sometimes late at night, I'd pause mid-sentence staring at the ink bleeding faintly into the paper. The numbers no longer just represented money. They represented every moment of trust I'd ever given away for free. When the evidence was enough to build a pattern, I called Mr. Lane, a family law attorney, recommended by a friend from church. He greeted me kindly but cautiously, as if unsure whether an elderly woman could truly fight a battle like this. I placed the folder on his desk. He opened it, glanced at the contents, then looked up slowly. "Mrs. Walsh," he said, "this isn't just infidelity. This is asset diversion. You have every right to protect yourself." We spent 2 hours outlining next steps: a petition for temporary control of shared assets, a motion to freeze joint accounts, and a formal request for full financial disclosure from Harold. I took notes carefully, every word crisp and deliberate. Before I left, Mr. Lane added quietly, "You're remarkably calm, Mrs. Walsh." I smiled faintly. "I've had a lifetime of practice hiding pain, Mr. Lane. This time I'm just using it." The night I spread all the papers across the table, I finally saw the full picture. Dates, transfers, receipts, lies. It was all there, black ink on white paper. The proof of betrayal was undeniable, yet strangely cleansing. Each page stripped away the illusions I had lived under for years. For a moment I let myself feel it. The sorrow, the rage, the disbelief. It came like a wave, cold and deep. Then as it receded, something steadier remained. Resolve. I gathered the papers, slid them into a folder, and whispered to the empty room. "You built your lies carefully, Harold, but I've built my truth even stronger." The night was silent again. The evidence sat before me, no longer just proof of betrayal, but the blueprint of my return. They met at a company fundraiser 2 years before everything fell apart. Sophie Collins, 28, ambitious, the kind of woman who never entered a room quietly. She was Harold's new marketing consultant, brought in to modernize his firm's image. At first, it was harmless meetings that ran late business dinners, polite laughter, but the tone shifted, subtle at first, then unmistakable. I remembered how he started checking his phone during dinner, smiling at messages he didn't explain. Later, he mentioned Sophie's name in passing, calling her brilliant sharp, a breath of fresh air. Fresh air. That's what he called the woman who slowly replaced the oxygen in my marriage. The paper trail told its own story. Luxury store receipts for handbags, spa vouchers, designer jewelry, all charged to our joint account. Transfers labeled consulting fees appeared regularly, small enough to hide from casual notice, but steady like a heartbeat. There was even a new credit card authorized under his name, but the statements went to another address. He thought no one would notice. He was wrong. The hotel invoices were the cruelest. The Windmere Inn. The Oak Ridge Suites weekends booked under false initials. I stared at each one, my name still listed as his spouse on the billing information, an irony almost too bitter to bear. Every dollar he spent on her was a stone removed from the foundation of the life we'd built. He was methodical, almost clever in how he hid it. He withdrew cash in odd amounts, never more than $500 at a time. He used delivery services to send gifts, leaving no trace of the sender's name. Some purchases were made under the company's expense account, buried in client entertainment. But secrets have weight, and they always leave fingerprints. The deeper I looked, the more tangled the web became, until even Harold's polished world began to fray at the edges. He had covered his tracks with precision, but not with conscience. When Maya and Tom finally saw the documents, their faces said everything. Shock first, then disbelief, then anger. Maya clenched her fists, whispering, "How could he do this to you?" Tom wanted to confront him immediately to demand answers, but I stopped them. "No shouting, no chaos," I told them. "He expects that. We'll give him silence instead, the kind that makes men nervous." They didn't understand at first, but they trusted me. I'd raised them to believe that truth, when revealed calmly, hurts much more than rage ever could. They both promised to stand by me, not as children protecting a parent, but as witnesses to justice. There was a time when Harold was different. He was the man who fixed leaky roofs himself, who saved every dollar for our children's education. He used to call me Ellie, his voice warm, steady, certain. We'd sit on the porch on summer nights, counting fireflies and promises. But somewhere between success and vanity, something in him cracked. He started dyeing his hair, buying expensive watches, talking about feeling young again. He mistook youth for freedom, and Sophie was his mirror, reflecting the man he wanted to believe he still was. The tragedy wasn't that he changed, it was that he forgot who he used to be. And Sophie, she was clever in her own way, not cruel, perhaps just calculating. She wanted comfort, stability, a shortcut to the life she envied. Maybe she convinced herself Harold truly loved her. Maybe she didn't care. When she met me once at a company dinner, she smiled too sweetly, complimented my necklace, the same one Harold later gifted her twin of. She wasn't ashamed. She didn't need to be. Men like Harold build women like Sophie, feed them attention, then act shocked when hunger becomes appetite. In the end, she wasn't his weakness. She was his reflection. By the time I finished assembling the final folder, the picture was complete. Dates, receipts, testimonies, transfers, every piece locked together like a cruel puzzle. It was no longer a story of betrayal. It was a legal case, airtight, undeniable. I didn't need revenge anymore. I had evidence. And evidence, unlike emotion, doesn't fade or flinch. I closed the folder and whispered to myself, "You built a life on lies, Harold. I built one on truth. Let's see which one stands longer." The lamp flickered on my desk as I sealed the envelope, ready for my lawyer's hands. The web was complete, and for the first time in months, I slept without nightmares. The morning I met with Mr. Lane again, the air in his office smelled faintly of old paper and coffee, the scent of serious things. He spread the documents I'd collected across his desk, scanning each page carefully. When he finally looked up, he nodded. "You've done half my job already, Mrs. Walsh." I smiled faintly. 40 years with Harold taught me to keep records. We discussed strategy, the steps, the timing, the risks. Mr. Lane spoke calmly, but his words carried weight once this began. There was no going back. I nodded. I had already lost my home once. I wasn't going to lose it again. 2 days later, we filed the petition for temporary control of the marital property. It wasn't about revenge, it was about preservation, making sure Harold couldn't sell, transfer, or destroy what we built before the court could decide who it truly belonged to. The petition was detailed. It listed the house, the bank accounts, the investments, and even the life insurance policies. Every item had a story. Every signature had a memory behind it. As I signed the bottom of the form, my hand didn't shake. This wasn't fear anymore, it was resolve. The clerk stamped the papers, the sound echoing through the quiet hallway. That dull thud marked the beginning of my return. The next step was the motion for full financial disclosure. We demanded Harold provide all bank statements, business contracts, and tax records, anything proving where the money had gone. Mr. Lane explained that once filed, he would be legally required to respond under oath. That meant lies could no longer hide behind charm. When I read the draft, I noticed how clean it looked, just words on paper. But between those lines lay the ghosts of every secret dinner, every hidden transfer, every moment I'd been made a fool. I initialed every page and whispered to myself, "Let the truth speak now." Then came the precautionary measures, the motion to freeze assets and a temporary travel restriction. Harold had business contacts abroad, and Mr. Lane worried he might try to move money out of reach. The process was tedious but necessary. We gathered evidence of suspicious withdrawals and presented them as justification. The judge listened quietly, her pen moving across the file. When she finally spoke, her tone was firm. "Until further notice, no joint accounts are to be altered. No funds to be transferred without consent. It was just a temporary order, but to me it felt like a small fortress, the first wall protecting what remained of my life." When Harold received the notice, chaos followed. Maya told me he showed up at her workplace furious. "How could your mother do this to me?" He'd shouted loud enough for her colleagues to hear. Sophie, meanwhile, tried a softer tactic, sending me a message through a mutual acquaintance pretending concern. "Eleanor, maybe we could talk woman to woman," she'd said. I didn't respond. People like her mistake silence for weakness. But my silence was my weapon, quiet, sharp waiting. If they wanted a reaction, they would have to read it in the court records, not on my face. Behind the scenes, I moved carefully. I didn't feed gossip or speak to the press, even when whispers spread around the neighborhood. Instead, I built my foundation with witnesses, documents, and discipline. Mrs. Callahan signed an affidavit confirming Sophie's presence at my house. Margaret, the former housekeeper, provided a written statement about Harold's late-night calls and secret deliveries. Even Peter, his colleague, agreed to testify about the consulting trips that were never on the company calendar. Each testimony was a brick laid neatly into place. I taught my children restraint. Anger burns fast, I told them, but patience wins slowly and permanently. They learned to stay quiet, to let the law do the talking. Every silence became another form of strength. The court hearing for the temporary petition came 3 weeks later. Harold's lawyer argued that I was being vindictive. Mr. Lane countered with calm precision, presenting receipts, bank transfers, witness statements. The judge reviewed everything for nearly an hour before delivering her verdict. Temporary control of the marital residence is granted to Mrs. Walsh pending further review. The words struck the air like a bell. I closed my eyes for a brief second, breathing it in. Not victory, not yet, but relief. The house was safe, at least for now. When we left the courtroom, Mr. Lane handed me a copy of the signed order. "This is just the first step," he said. I nodded. "That's fine. Every journey back home starts with one." That night, I placed the court order beside my bed and slept with the light on, not out of fear, but out of comfort. For the first time since Harold had thrown me out, I knew the law was no longer on his side. It was on the side of truth, and I was ready to follow it all the way through. It started with a single envelope. Harold tore it open at the kitchen table, expecting another statement, another bill to ignore, but this one hit differently. Inside was a final notice from the bank. The joint account he once guarded so carefully had been drained, every cent from his private investment fund gone. Sophie had vanished overnight, leaving only a text. "I'm sorry. I need time to think." She hadn't just taken his affection. She'd taken his money too. Neighbors saw him wandering outside that morning, muttering into his phone, calling numbers that went straight to voicemail. For the first time in his life, Harold Walsh looked like a man who didn't know where to go next. The investment had been Sophie's idea, a tech startup promising luxury home automation. Harold, desperate to impress her, poured money into it, emptying savings meant for retirement. She convinced him it would double in a year. Instead, it folded within months. Contracts were canceled, suppliers withdrew, and the company's name disappeared from the registry overnight. All that remained were unpaid invoices and Harold's signature at the bottom of every failed deal. When he realized that Sophie had not only left him but also left him bankrupt, he slammed his fist against the desk. Papers scattered like snow across the floor. He didn't know yet, but the empire he built on lies had already started to crumble. Panic crept in slowly, then swallowed him whole. He stopped sleeping. His hands shook when he tried to write checks that bounced. He called Maya one evening, voice trembling, asking if I would talk to him. She said I was busy, which was true. I was busy rebuilding the life he had tried to destroy. Without money, Harold's confidence deflated. He began to remember me, the steady woman who had once kept his world from falling apart. Regret can be cruel when it arrives too late. He wanted to come back, but pride chained him to his own mistakes. And by then there was no space left in my heart for pity. At the next court hearing, Mr. Lane and I presented the financial summary. Every dollar Harold had hidden now stood exposed in black and white. The judge flipped through the binder page after page of bank transfers, hotel receipts, cash withdrawals. These, Mr. Lane said, were not business expenses. They were personal indulgences paid from marital assets. Harold tried to speak, but the judge raised her hand. Silence. His face reddened as his own lawyer struggled to defend the indefensible. By the end of the session, the court declared several transactions invalid pending recovery. It wasn't just humiliation. It was accountability. The lies he thought he buried had come back as evidence, sharp and permanent. Rumors travel faster than justice. Within a week, word spread through the neighborhood and his business circles. The once respected Harold Walsh, family man, businessman, pillar of the community, had been exposed. Old friends stopped answering his calls. The golf club quietly suspended his membership. Even the neighbors crossed the street when they saw him coming. He who had cared so deeply about reputation now had none left to protect. Sometimes I heard snippets in the market whispers that trailed off when I entered. I never corrected them. Truth didn't need my defense anymore. It was doing just fine on its own. Sophie, for her part, moved on quickly. When Harold finally tracked her down, she was living in another city. New number, new partner, same ambition. She didn't return his calls, didn't acknowledge the money she'd taken. To her, he was no longer useful. And to Harold, the realization was crushing. He had traded a lifetime of loyalty for a fleeting illusion. Now he sat in a rented apartment with unpaid bills and fading pride, watching the world he once controlled slip through his fingers. The man who threw me out of our home was now the one looking for shelter. I didn't celebrate. I didn't gloat. But I did notice something shift, a quiet balance restoring itself. For months I had built my case with precision, never letting anger dictate my next step. And now the weight of his own actions was doing the work for me. Harold's downfall wasn't my victory. It was simply consequence, the universe keeping its own accounts. Late one evening, Maya called. "Mom, I think Dad's different now. He sounds broken." I paused, then said softly, "Sometimes that's the only way people learn what they broke." That night I looked out the window of my temporary home, the moon hanging low over the quiet street. Somewhere out there, Harold was facing his own silence, the kind that comes when there's no one left to lie to. And I knew the next step was mine. The emotional battle was over. The legal one had just begun. The courthouse smelled faintly of polish and paper, a sterile kind of air where lives were quietly redefined. I arrived early, carrying the folder that had taken months of my life to build. Mr. Lane greeted me with a nod, his briefcase already open, full of neatly organized files. Behind us sat Maya and Tom, their faces tight with quiet pride. In the row behind them, Mrs. Callahan and Margaret waited to testify. Each person there carried a piece of truth, and together we were ready. I adjusted my glasses, exhaled, and whispered to myself, "This isn't about winning, it's about ending it right." When the session began, Harold sat across the courtroom, gray-faced and smaller than I remembered. His lawyer spoke first, a man with too much confidence and too little conscience. He painted me as a bitter wife seeking revenge after misunderstandings in a long marriage. I didn't flinch. When it was our turn, Mr. Lane stood slowly, every movement deliberate. "Your Honor," he began, "this isn't a story of revenge. It's a case of accountability." I took the stand, my voice steady, my words measured. I told the truth plainly, how the accounts changed, how receipts appeared, how my husband withdrew from our life one secret at a time. No anger, no tears, just facts. I saw the judge's pen pause mid-note when I said, "I'm not here because my heart was broken. I'm here because my home was stolen." The courtroom went silent. Then came the evidence, the heart of it all. Mr. Lane presented the documents one by one, receipts for jewelry and hotels, wire transfers to SC Consulting credit card bills in Harold's name, but Sophie's address. Every page was time-stamped, authenticated, undeniable. Funds from the marital account, Mr. Lane explained, were repeatedly redirected for the benefit of a third party, Ms. Sophie Collins. He passed copies to the judge, each one sliding across the wood like a verdict waiting to happen. Harold's lawyer objected: speculation, irrelevance, emotional bias. The judge overruled him every time. And when the final document, a notarized letter from the bank, was read aloud, the truth stood naked in the room. Harold was called to the stand next. He shuffled forward, his steps heavy. The man who once commanded rooms now avoided everyone's eyes. When asked about the transactions, he stammered, "It was business-related, just temporary." Mr. Lane leaned forward. "Then why were the receipts for weekend stays at the Windmere Inn?" Mr. Walsh silence. Harold's shoulders sagged. He tried to explain, words tumbling out like broken glass, but the more he spoke, the smaller he became. At one point he looked at me, really looked as if hoping I'd rescue him from the consequences of his own actions. But I didn't, not this time. The judge's decision came after a long pause. Her tone was calm, but her words carried the weight of justice. After reviewing all presented evidence, the court finds that Mr. Harold Walsh has misused shared marital assets for personal gain. Effective immediately, all high-risk investments are to be frozen. The marital residence shall remain under sole ownership of Mrs. Eleanor Walsh. I didn't smile. I simply closed my eyes. The gavel struck once a sharp, clean sound, and 40 years of silence finally ended. Harold slumped into his chair, staring at the floor. Sophie didn't show up that day. Perhaps she already knew how this would end. After the hearing, Mr. Lane placed the final document in my hands, the official transfer of ownership. "It's yours now," he said quietly. For a long moment I couldn't speak. The house I had built, lost and fought for, finally mine again. But I didn't want to live there the same way. Pain leaves its fingerprints on the walls, so I decided to change what the house meant. Within a month, I sold off Harold's failed investments, using what remained to start something new, Walsh Haven, a place where women, especially those left behind late in life, could find shelter, advice, and a fresh start. My lawyer helped set up the paperwork. My children offered to volunteer. The home that once symbolized betrayal would now stand for resilience. Brick by brick, I was reclaiming not just my property but my purpose. That evening, as I left the courthouse, the sky was beginning to turn gold. Reporters waited near the steps, but I walked past them without a word. Truth didn't need an audience. At the bottom of the stairs, I looked back once, not at the building, but at the life I was finally free from. The storm had passed. All that was left was rebuilding. And somewhere behind those courthouse walls, Harold would have to face his own echo, the sound of a gavel marking the moment he lost everything, not because I destroyed him, but because he destroyed himself. The gate creaked as I pushed it open. For a moment, I just stood there, staring at the house, my house, the same white shutters, the same porch, but somehow smaller than I remembered. The air smelled of dust and old paint. Every corner whispered memories, Sunday dinners, laughter arguments, and the sound of Harold's footsteps on the stairs. I ran my hand along the gatepost rough with time and whispered, "I'm home." Tears came quiet and steady, not from sadness, but from the strange relief of belonging again. After everything that had been taken from me, I had come back not as a wife, but as the woman who had built these walls and earned them back. The first few days were quiet work. I opened windows long shut, let sunlight spill into the rooms, and began to clean. I repainted the living room in soft, cream-pulled weeds from the garden and scrubbed the kitchen until the counters shone again. Every sweep of the broom felt symbolic, clearing away the ghosts of betrayal, making space for something new. The neighbors began to appear one by one, offering to help. Mrs. Callahan brought fresh flowers, Tom fixed the fence, and Maya painted the mailbox. It was as if the whole street wanted to help the house breathe again. By the end of the week, it looked less like the place I'd lost, and more like the home I was creating anew. When everything was ready, I decided it was time to open the doors again, not just for myself. So I hosted a small gathering. A potluck dinner, simple and warm. Neighbors filled the garden with laughter, clinking glasses under strings of yellow lights. I stood on the porch and raised a glass. "This house has seen storms," I said, "but it still stands. And from now on it will stand for more than just me. It will stand for anyone who's had to start over." They clapped, some with tears in their eyes. It was no longer a story of scandal, it was a story of renewal. The whispers that once followed my name turned into respect. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like the woman who'd been thrown out. I felt like the woman who had returned stronger. That night, after the guests had gone, I sat at the kitchen table and opened my notebook again. On a blank page, I wrote, Walsh Haven. The name came naturally, a place of safety named after both the pain and the perseverance that birthed it. I wanted this house to become more than a symbol of survival. It had to become a shelter for others, women who'd been left behind, widows, divorcees, anyone who needed a place to stand while rebuilding their lives. The next morning, I met with a local nonprofit consultant, discussed funding, and began the process of registering Walsh Haven as a community foundation. The idea filled me with the kind of purpose I hadn't felt in years. Revenge had turned into rebuilding, and rebuilding had turned into service. Within a month, the house had changed again, this time into something living. We set up 2 guest rooms, a small office in what used to be Harold's study, and a cozy reading corner by the window. 2 women joined, first Martha, a retired nurse whose landlord had sold her apartment, and June, a widow who hadn't spoken to anyone in months. A kind local dentist volunteered to help with medical checks, and Maya handled logistics. It was small, imperfect, and underfunded, but it worked. Every evening we sat in the garden, 3 women drinking tea and sharing stories. They told me they hadn't laughed that much in years. Neither had I. Of course, the early days weren't easy. There were forms to fill out, inspections to pass, taxes to settle, and critics who doubted the idea. The plumbing broke twice and donations ran low, but every challenge felt different from the ones before because this time the struggle was mine. One afternoon, as I watched Martha teaching June how to knit in the sunroom, I realized something simple but powerful. He had taken my money, but I had found meaning. He had built an illusion of youth. I had built a home for rebirth. The exchange seemed more than fair. On the evening of our first official day as Walsh Haven, I walked through the house slowly, turning off each light. The walls glowed faintly in the dusk, the garden still smelling of lavender. I reached the front door, locked it gently, and held the key in my hand. It felt lighter than I remembered. Maybe because this time it didn't just open a door, it opened a future. I smiled and whispered to the empty hallway, "You tried to take this from me, Harold, but this house was never yours. It was always waiting for the right owner, the one who knew how to protect it." I slipped the key into my pocket and stepped into the night. Behind me, the house stood strong and quiet, no longer haunted by loss, but humming softly with life again. Harold wandered through the streets like a man untethered. He called old friends, no one answered. He stopped by the cafe where he once met clients, but the owner looked away, pretending not to know him. Even his golf partners avoided eye contact. Loneliness has a sound, the hollow click of footsteps with no destination. He went home to an empty apartment, the silence louder than the city outside. For the first time, Harold felt the weight of what he'd built, not wealth, not reputation, but isolation. He used to think I was the one who couldn't live without him. Now he knew better. The financial collapse came next. Letters from the bank arrived in waves, overdraft notices, account freezes, final demands. His credit cards were canceled, his business loans revoked. One by one, the pillars he'd leaned on fell away. He tried selling what little he had left, his car, his watches, but the numbers didn't add up. He'd spent too long pretending debt was just another inconvenience. Now it was the only company he had left. Even the small pension fund he'd hidden from me was flagged and seized as part of the asset audit. The man who once measured life in possessions was now counting coins to buy groceries. He thought Sophie might come back. She didn't. Her number was disconnected. The apartment they once shared was empty. Neighbors said she'd moved abroad, maybe to France, maybe with someone else. He tried writing to her the letters, short and desperate, "I miss you. I need you." None were answered. He waited for weeks, then months, until hope turned to humiliation. When he finally understood she wasn't coming back, he sat in the dark, the television flickering silently across his tired face. He whispered my name once, not out of love, but out of loss. He'd burned every bridge, and the only one still standing was the one he'd set fire to first. Then one afternoon, the inevitable happened. He showed up at my door. The knock was soft, almost apologetic. When I opened it, I barely recognized him, thinner, older eyes, heavy with regret. He held his hat in trembling hands. "Eleanor," he said quietly, "I've made mistakes. Terrible ones. I lost everything. I need a place to rest for a while." His voice cracked on the last word. For a moment, I said nothing. Then I stepped aside and gestured toward the chair by the doorway. He sat down, looking around the house that was once his kingdom. "You've done well," he murmured. "The place looks beautiful." I nodded. "It does. It's finally at peace." He looked down. "I didn't mean to hurt you." "You didn't mean to," I replied. "But you did." He wiped his face, his pride gone. "I don't expect forgiveness," he whispered. "Just mercy." I let the silence linger before I spoke. Harold, mercy isn't something you ask for after you've destroyed someone's home. It's something you practice before you do. He looked at me, truly looked for the first time in years. "I have nowhere to go," he said. I folded my hands. "That's not true. You have the truth now. That's a place to start." He didn't understand. Most men like him never do. "You taught me to be loyal." "Harold," I continued softly, "but you also taught me what happens when loyalty is given to the wrong person. I won't repeat that mistake." His eyes filled again. "So that's it. After everything, you won't let me in." "You left long before you walked out that door," I said. "This house was built on faith. You broke it. And what's rebuilt now has no room for ghosts." He stood slowly, nodded once, and whispered, "I'm sorry. I know I said. I just hope someday you understand what that really means." The neighborhood saw him wandering again in the weeks that followed. He rented a small room above a laundromat, lived off cheap meals and charity. The man who once hosted dinner parties now ate alone. His name became a cautionary tale, a reminder of how arrogance turns to ruin. Even his grandchildren avoided his calls, not out of hatred, but out of discomfort. No one knew what to say to the man who had everything, and lost it all, not to tragedy, but to his own choices. I sometimes caught neighbors whispering when they saw him shuffling down the street, coat too thin for the cold. And every time I just kept walking. He wasn't my burden anymore. One evening, I stood on the porch watching as he disappeared down the road, a fading shadow against the sunset. For the first time in a long while, my heart didn't twist with anger or sorrow. It was simply still. Peace doesn't always come with joy. Sometimes it arrives quietly in the space where pain used to live. I closed the door behind me, the soft click echoing through the hallway. This, I thought, was the real victory, not the legal one, not the financial one, but the freedom to look at what was once my greatest wound and feel nothing but calm. "Goodbye, Harold," I whispered to the empty air. "You finally taught me the most important lesson of all, how to stand alone and still call it enough." Walsh Haven began as just one house, a quiet refuge with 3 women and a dream. But within months, it had become something larger. The empty rooms filled with new voices, the kitchen turned into a meeting hall, and the garden became a sanctuary for anyone starting over. We hired 2 part-time coordinators, a retired teacher to handle paperwork, and a young volunteer from the university who managed our social media. Soon we had 5 people working together, 5 hearts with one purpose. The home that was once a symbol of loss had become a growing organization built on renewal. Every new arrival brought a different story, and every story added another brick to the foundation of Walsh Haven. Our programs grew naturally shaped by the women themselves. Some wanted to learn sewing again, a skill they thought was useless in a world that moved too fast. So we opened the Stitch Room, a place to teach them how to make garments, quilts, and small crafts to sell at local fairs. Others asked for help finding work, so we partnered with nearby businesses to offer job readiness training, how to write resumes, how to interview with confidence, how to manage money. I invited a retired accountant to teach financial literacy, and we began small workshops on starting home-based businesses, catering online crafts tutoring. The women came shy, uncertain, clutching their bags like shields. But after a few weeks, they stood taller. They laughed louder. They called themselves the Haven Sisters. Support from the community came next, small, steady, and sincere. Neighbors donated furniture and garden tools. Local shops held charity days, sending part of their profits our way. Former clients of Harold's firm women, who remembered me from his company parties, mailed anonymous checks. Even the city council offered a small grant, impressed by our early results. It wasn't much, but every bit counted. Sometimes generosity doesn't shout. It simply arrives quietly in envelopes and handwritten notes that say, "Thank you for what you're doing." And for the first time, the word home didn't just belong to me. It belonged to everyone who believed that starting over wasn't a weakness, but a triumph. Among the women who came through Walsh Haven, one story stays with me most. Her name was Ruth, 70 years old with silver hair and trembling hands. She'd lost her husband 2 years earlier, then her apartment when the rent doubled. When she arrived, she barely spoke. For weeks she sat in the garden watching others from a distance. One afternoon, I handed her a small packet of seeds. "Would you like to help me plant these?" I asked. She nodded. Every morning after that, she tended those flowers. Slowly the silence broke. She joined our sewing classes, made scarves for winter drives, and eventually started selling her own handmade bags. At the end of the season, she handed me her first envelope of earnings, $56. She smiled and said, "It's not much, but it's mine. I made this with my own hands." That moment reminded me why Walsh Haven existed. It wasn't about rebuilding wealth, it was about rebuilding worth. As months turned into years, Walsh Haven became self-sustaining. We sold handmade goods online, received small government grants, and hosted fundraisers in the garden each spring. The books balanced themselves for the first time, and I no longer worried about running out of money. More importantly, the women who once came for help began helping others, teaching, mentoring, donating back into the circle. Our success wasn't measured in profit margins, but in transformations, trembling voices becoming confident, broken hearts finding peace. People often said, "You've done something incredible, Eleanor," but I always answered, "No, we did this together." Then came the day I was asked to speak publicly, a women's leadership conference in the city. At first, I hesitated. I wasn't a speaker. But they insisted, saying Walsh Haven's story had inspired many. When I stepped onto the stage, the lights were bright and the room was full. I told them everything, not just about the foundation, but about the pain that birthed it. I spoke of betrayal, resilience, and the quiet power of women who refuse to disappear. When I said, "I lost my home once, but in finding others theirs, I found my own again," the audience rose to their feet. Afterward, several women approached me, tears in their eyes, saying, "You gave me hope." That night, for the first time, I realized that survival can turn into leadership if you let it. One evening back at Walsh Haven, I sat in the garden under the fading light. The roses were in full bloom, their scent mingling with the laughter of women inside. From the kitchen window, I could see Ruth teaching another newcomer how to thread a needle. I closed my eyes and breathed deeply. The house that once held heartbreak now pulsed with life. The garden that once grew weeds now blossomed with second chances. I smiled to myself and whispered, maybe this was the plan all along, to lose everything so I could learn what truly lasts. The wind brushed through the flowers soft and kind, like an old friend, and for the first time in my long life, I felt completely whole. Sometimes when the morning light fell across my desk just right, I thought of my mother. She was a seamstress, hands rough back, bent eyes always steady. She used to say, "Work with honesty, Eleanor. Even when no one thanks you for it, dignity is the only thing that never wears out." Back then, I never understood how much truth was packed into that single sentence. Now at 73, I finally did. She hadn't just taught me how to sew fabric. She had taught me how to stitch myself back together with patience, with pride, and with purpose. The children came home that spring for a small celebration at Walsh Haven. Not an anniversary, not a birthday, just life itself. We set a long table under the blooming magnolia tree. Maya brought her 2 sons. Tom arrived with his wife, and the garden filled with laughter and the smell of roasted chicken. There was no talk of Harold, no shadow of bitterness, only warmth. At one point, Tom raised his glass and said, "Mom, you didn't just survive, you built something that will outlive all of us." I smiled, eyes glistening, and replied, "I only did what every mother hopes to do, leave the world a little softer for those who come next." That evening, as the candles flickered low, I realized that forgiveness sometimes arrives disguised as peace. Not loud, not dramatic, just quiet acceptance shared over dinner with the people you love most. Forgiveness had been a puzzle my whole life. Did I forgive Harold? The question came up often from friends, from reporters, even from women who came to Walsh Haven seeking their own closure. At first, I didn't know what to say. But one day, while watching the sunset over the garden, I finally understood. Forgiveness isn't forgetting. It isn't pretending the pain never happened. It's simply setting down the weight before it crushes you. You let go not for them, but for yourself. Harold had carried his regret until the end, and I carried the lesson. Neither of us won or lost. We just lived what we created. And that, in its own way, was justice. When summer came, I sat down with my lawyer, Mr. Lane, one last time. We reviewed my will line by line. I wanted no confusion after I was gone. The house, the foundation, the accounts, all carefully structured to ensure that Walsh Haven would live beyond me. "This is your legacy, Mrs. Walsh?" he said, sliding the papers forward. I nodded. "No," I answered softly. "This is our legacy, mine, and every woman who walked through those doors and found her strength again." We signed the documents in silence. The sound of the pen scratching against paper felt final but not sad, like closing the last page of a long, honest story. Part of the new plan included a scholarship fund. We called it the Eleanor Grant for Second Chances. Each year, it would provide housing and small grants for older women, those who had lost homes, jobs, or families, and needed a place to rebuild. It wasn't much, but it was something tangible, something that could outlast me. We also set aside a small garden plot in back where every new resident would plant a flower, representing her fresh start. When people asked why I cared so deeply about helping women my age, I told them the truth. Because the world is kinder to those who begin and cruel to those who begin again. I want to change that even just a little. As the years went on, my grandchildren grew curious about my past. One evening they gathered around me by the fireplace, their small faces glowing in the amber light. Grandma, the youngest, asked, "Were you ever scared?" I smiled. "All the time. But courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing what's right, even when fear is still in the room." I told them about hard work, about how beauty fades, but integrity does not. I told them that money can be lost, but character is something no thief can steal. And when they asked how I built Walsh Haven, I said, with patience with good people, and with the belief that even broken things can build something beautiful again. They listened quietly, and I could see a spark of understanding, the kind that passes from one generation to the next, wordlessly, but permanently. Later that night, I sat alone in the garden watching the lights glow softly in the windows. Voices of women drifted through the air, laughter, music, life. I didn't feel old or tired. I felt complete. No anger, no grudges, no unfinished business. The world had taken from me once, but I had given back something greater. The difference between revenge and justice, I realized, was legacy. I folded my hands, closed my eyes, and whispered to the wind. No hatred left, no vengeance needed. My life has already spoken for me. The night was calm, the air warm against my face. Somewhere inside, the sound of a sewing machine hummed softly, the same rhythm that had once filled my mother's house decades ago. And I smiled, knowing the stitch was complete, not just in fabric, but in fate. Morning light poured softly through the kitchen windows of Walsh Haven. The smell of toast and coffee drifted through the air, mingling with laughter. Women of every age sat around the long oak table, passing plates of fruit and homemade jam. Someone was playing the radio quietly in the corner. The tune was cheerful, familiar. From the garden came the sound of watering cans and the chatter of two new residents discussing what to plant next. It was an ordinary morning, but for me it felt extraordinary, the kind of peace that only comes after every storm has passed. This was not just a house anymore. It was life reborn. Sometimes I caught myself looking back, tracing the invisible thread that had led me here, from that morning I was thrown out suitcase in hand, to standing before a judge, to reclaiming not just my home, but my voice. There had been years of pain, of rebuilding, of paperwork and purpose. But every step, every scar had meaning now. I remembered sitting in Maya's guest room, sewing quietly while plotting my next move. The courtroom where Harold avoided my eyes. The first night back in the house, surrounded by dust and silence. And now, here it was, filled with laughter work and warmth. The circle had closed not in revenge, but in restoration. It was strange how life had a way of returning what it once stole, only transformed. One afternoon I saw him again. Harold, an old man, now frail, unshaven, standing by the gate with a cane. He looked up as I approached, eyes tired but no longer angry. "Eleanor," he said softly, "I just wanted to see it. The house. You did well." I nodded, keeping my distance. "It's not just a house anymore, Harold. It's a home for people who needed one." He smiled faintly, as if relieved. "I'm glad. You found peace. There was no apology left to give, and none I needed." He turned to leave, pausing once to look back before disappearing down the road. For the first time, I didn't see the man who had betrayed me, only another soul learning the hard truth that some losses are lessons. Walsh Haven continued to grow beyond my hands. Stories of its work spread, small articles in local papers, online videos shared quietly between women who needed hope. More visitors arrived every month, widows, retirees, survivors of quiet battles no one else saw. They came broken, left braver. Some started businesses, some reconciled with estranged families, others simply found peace in the garden's silence. Each success was a seed planted proof that this place had become more than a shelter. It was living legacy, breathing proof that tragedy could bloom into purpose. I sometimes watched from the porch as new arrivals unpacked their bags, smiling shyly, and thought, this is how healing looks, slow, steady, shared. If people asked me what revenge looked like, I told them the truth. Revenge isn't destruction, it's creation. To rebuild what was taken, to give more than what was lost, to stand tall without bitterness and know your worth was never measured in what someone else could steal. Justice had never been about courtrooms or signatures. It was about dignity, quiet, unshakable, earned day by day. I had learned that transparency is the purest kind of vengeance, and generosity, the final act of freedom. When you give without resentment, you win the kind of victory no thief can touch. As the years went by, I spoke less about my own story and more about the future. At every event, I told women, don't wait for someone to save you. Build your own door, your own key, your own home. We opened new branches, small rented houses in nearby towns managed by women who once lived in Walsh Haven themselves. Volunteers, donors, and community partners joined the cause. Every new garden, every shared meal became a continuation of the same dream. I began ending my speeches with the same invitation: if you've ever lost everything, you already have the courage to begin again. Come and help someone else do the same. It wasn't just a call for charity, it was a call for connection. Because healing, I had learned, only multiplies when it's shared. One evening, as the sun began to set, I walked slowly down the garden path, listening to the laughter spilling from inside. The roses were in bloom again, thick, fragrant, defiant. I reached the gate, turned the key, and locked it gently. Then I stood still, watching the sky shift from gold to violet. My hands were old now, lined with time, but steady. I smiled and whispered, "This is the last home, mine and ours." The house behind me glowed softly in the fading light, alive with voices and hope. And in that moment, I knew I hadn't just built a place to live. I had built a reason to keep living, proof that from the ruins of betrayal, something far stronger could rise.